Morning to you. Really a warm welcome to this new webinar organized by Public Safety Communication Europe, which will be prolonged by a workshop, a collaborative workshop at the end. So my name is Marie-Christine Bonamour. I am the Secretary General of PSCE. And as we just say with Monica, so pleased to have a large audience. We had more than 150 registrants. I'm coming from 22 countries. I will now share my presentation. So a few words of introduction for this webinar on use cases and scenario for good practitioner-led innovation, PPDR. I will just present briefly PSCE, who we are. We are a forum which is gathering three communities, and we foster a dialogue among this community. Today's webinar is, of course, an example of this. So we are gathering end-user practitioner community, researcher and industry together to discuss what are some technical problems, not only technical, but problems in public safety communication. What could be the solution? What are the trends in research? And really generating this communication among the three groups, which is really essential. What we are doing, of course, we are representing our community near the institutions, mainly DG Home, DG Connect, DG Echo. We are preparing and developing roadmaps on technology evolution. So we are working a lot on broadband communication. We issued a document on IoT for public safety, 5G for PPDR. We are taking part in standardization activities. PSC is a member of ETSI, a member of 3GPP. We are contributing to CEN. We've been participating in our co-chairing CEN workshop agreements. Also present in your project to represent our members and provide our expertise. We are organizing events, so this webinar, but also workshops, but also large conference. Hopefully next year we will be able to have one again. And we have a wide range of publications from white paper, newsletter, news, article, flash news. So the agenda of today, we'll have 5 speakers, and the purpose of this webinar is really to present ethical and societal challenges posed by innovation and how to co-create innovation that will respect these dimensions from the very start of the process. And we'll see that with our 5 speakers. There is a constant of new solution or even an acceleration of potential new solution to improve the capacity of public protection organizations. But there is at the same time a need to ensure that solutions do not compromise our legal rules or societal core values. We can mention the debate on facial recognition, for example, or also the checks that have been conducted for tracing apps that have been developed recently. And we tackled this issue during some of our previous webinars as well. So how to stimulate innovation, how to generate ethical innovation, and how to keep practitioner in a leading role for this innovation. So before giving the floor to Monica Buscher from the Lancaster University, I would like to give you and remind you of some rules for our webinar. So the video and the presentations will be made available, circulated after the event. You will be all muted during the presentations. As Monica also mentioned, please write your question under the chat. So it's at the bottom of your WebEx screen, and indicate to whom you address them. And also, thank you. It's not so friendly, but to turn off your camera so that we can keep high quality of this webinar. So now the floor will be to Monica Buscher for the first presentation.
Monica, you're muted.
Monica, yeah, you're muted.
Okay, try again.
Yeah, now we can listen to you.
Okay, and you can see the slides as well. Okay, so
You can put panorama, yeah.
yeah, okay, very good. So today is about good practitioner-led innovation and the use of use cases, scenarios, social impact assessment, and ethical impact assessment as part of that. So why do we need practitioner-led innovation? I just want to play you a short clip from a video by the Department of Homeland Security.
Who's in trouble?
Fire Team 1, it looks like we have a mayday. Firefighter Thompson is down. Heart and breathing rate spiking.
Roger, Chief. Got pinned by check of ceiling. We're also bringing out 2 civilians. We put vital sensors on them. EMS should be getting readings now.
EMS, do you copy the message from Fire Team 1?
Got it, Chief. I'm getting vital signs on 1 firefighter, 2 civilians.
Looks like we have 2 red tag patients with severe burns and trouble breathing, and a firefighter with possible crush injury. I need you to start the IV and get ready to intubate. Audrey, connect me to the nearest trauma center.
Linking to St. Anthony's Trauma Center, 3.7 miles.
That's one of the few videos that I know of that is actually really involving practitioners in the experimentation with new technologies and trying to play through how they might work in real life, in real practice. And that's really important because we are living through a new reality of disaster risk management. Everyday life is full of smartphones and super fast, high multimedia technologies, and some of the disaster risk management is still in the stone age of technology. But innovation is moving super fast in this area, and it is disruptive innovation. So that means that actually by appropriating new technologies, you change the way you work. So actually being able to send data ahead to the hospital on trauma patients, what does that do? It changes the way the hospital works. It changes also the responsibilities that the hospital has. If they know in advance what kind of injuries these people have, they need to be better prepared to respond to those. So the expectations change. So what we see in innovation around disaster risk management is that there are unknowable outcomes and positive and quite complex outcomes. So you could say that practitioners know best, and they really need to be involved in shaping how that innovation happens. And there are other reasons, and we have experience of what happens when we don't involve practitioners. So the picture that you see is from the UK. It's about the fire control an attempt to centralize fire services, which was a complete failure. It was £500 million of investment in a center that was never used. And there are other examples of costly mistakes of how technologies are developed in ways that do not involve practitioners enough and then end up failures. And the contact tracing that Marie-Christine mentioned could be seen as another example shaping up of this, perhaps. So what are the challenges for practitioner-led innovations? One thing is that, yes, we might think that practitioners know best, but do they know best about everything? Of course not. They don't know about the potential of the technologies. They might know about their own organizations, but not every organization, and about the interoperability. So it is actually not always the case that practitioners know best about everything. So what we need to do is design for experimentation. We need to design for trust in technology, for flexibility, and for security. And some of those things are actually, excuse me, mutually exclusive. So if you design for flexibility, then it's very difficult to also make that very secure. And if you design for simplicity, it's very difficult to also design for trust and explain how the technologies work to practitioners. And it's not just about the practitioners, there's also the public and citizens. And then there are also issues about the fact that practitioners are citizens too and have rights for informational self-determination. I'll give you an example around that. So innovation is moving really fast, for example, around artificial intelligence, the internet for public safety things, and big data analytics. There are 5 billion connected things today, potentially 25 billion, well, now, actually. And some of those things are body cams and biosensors. So in the UK, we had, in 2017, almost 50,000 body cameras. And they can be very effective in monitoring what is happening and providing data, but also in improving the accountability of police forces. And in the States, where there are big issues around this, complaints about officers have fallen in response to the use of body-worn cameras. So there is a disruptive, good momentum around these technologies, and it's very powerful. But you can also, at the same time, see how these cameras are piling on the pressure. So on the one hand, the camera should always record, but then in some situations, the officers might want to have discretion to turn them off. But if it's turned off, do they then have to account for it? And it is also, could they be recording vulnerable people and have good reasons to turn them off? And how do they process all this responsibility as they are doing their job? So, and there are also issues about themselves being recorded. So if you think about biosensors and firefighters at risk of heart disease, and if they wear biosensors and the chief sees that somebody is under immense physiological pressure, should they then pull them? And if they don't pull them from the team, what are their responsibilities for the health and well-being of that member of staff? So there are all these really complicated consequences, unintended, some of them, of innovation. And so to do what we really need to do is do innovation together. And this idea of good as a tick box exercise is really not good enough. It's a matter of making innovation good together in ways that are more collaborative. So this is why we're here. This is why we are focusing on how do we make use cases? How do we make scenarios together? How do we do ethical impact assessment and social impact assessment together through methods for creating, experimenting, and evaluating? And I want to show you something that we are doing in PSCE, which is a use case exchange. So we've made a prototype. In our conferences, we often put together practitioners, researchers, and industry developers of technology to make use cases and discuss how to do good practitioner-led innovation. And so we've pulled together some of these. So what is this use case exchange? It's a way of pooling together these examples and stories to make a concrete substrate for creativity and dialogue and shape good futures before we get too far down the road. And if I just show you one example from the Paris conference in December last year, this is how the use case exchange works. So there are pictures, and then there are stories of, for example, how on a motorway accident you could use the cameras that are already there to understand better what is going on. And then we also have video clips that then tell those stories. and they really enact the story to get a sense of how this would work in practice.
Second crash. CCTV camera is now registering an incident based on abnormal behavior and sending an alert to the control room with pictures.
Images received at the control room, and the IA creates an alert on.
And the benefit of really playing through how the camera receives the pictures, how it sends it, and how the AI then identifies unusual activities there, that's really important to really understand what is going on. What we also do in PSCE and through, for example, the Broadway project is develop use case scenarios. And one of the things that comes out of doing this with practitioners is that they often ask, how can we trust these new complex technologies that, for example, enable cross-border collaborations and interoperability between the different agencies? And one of the things that we have developed at Lancaster is a use case, is it ethical impact assessment? And I'll just play you a short clip from that, and you just ignore me. It's all about trust.
My second action, I'm gonna open a common information space because I think I need collaboration.
You've got to take care of everybody else around you, right? Everyone else who's working with you in a common information space. You may have different agencies, different countries involved. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah. What do the others think?
Yeah, absolutely.
You build trust.
Currently, where we exchange data with other agencies, we tend to do it through data sharing agreements. So we document what we can and cannot share, how we'll share it, and the obligations on each party to safeguard that data. So there's a process there to try and provide those safeguards, but it requires somebody to sign up to an agreement.
So about trust, it's a very relevant card because it's the reason why I opened my own CRS, because we...
So it's really about trust. And what we have done is developed a board game to enable conversations between the different parties involved and to understand the ethical implications of sharing information across borders and in collaborations between different organizations. And that guidance is also an online resource where we describe, it's like a one-stop shop of key terms of issues that arise in interoperating across borders and organizations. And then there is detailed guidance on particular issues and, for example, cross-border collaborations, and it's all cross-linked. And there are guiding questions for practitioner innovation, but also more technical inspiration for how to address the challenges that arise. And we provide a set of services around this ethical impact assessment. Other projects have also developed social and societal impact assessment, because one of the things that was discussed hotly at the last conference in Paris was raised by Guillaume Lambert, the head of public safety broadband at the French Interior Ministry, who says that, yes, the technologies might be ready to share data and video, but the public is not ready, and we need to convince them, he says. For me, it's more a question of, well, you know, why should they be buying into this? And they have often good reasons why they are not buying into it and concerns, and we need to have more ambitious and better design. And so we are developing a societal readiness levels framework to help understand how ready our innovations are for the public, for society, and how good they are for society. I don't have time to go into that in detail because I just want to move us on into the other presentations and ask, you know, how do we do good practitioner-led innovation? It's about bringing practitioners, IT developers, and researchers together, supporting knowledge exchange and co-creation, and demand and make more ambitious design that addresses the challenges for practitioners, for society. And that is it for me. It's about, let's get to work, and I hand over to Katrina and Adam.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you, Monica.
And please put your questions in the chat. And not just questions, but also examples of challenges that you've experienced. Okay.
I think you should all see the slides now. And
yes,
Katrina, go ahead, please.
All right. So Adam and I are going to talk about some of the work that we're doing, thinking about using scenarios and use cases and trials within the Stamina project. This is a project that has just begun. But first, actually, if you want to go to the next slide, what we're going to do first is tell you a little bit about the project, just to frame the context of our work. Adam is going to tell you a bit about the Driver Plus methodology for trial, the trial guidance methodology that's been developed that we're expanding in this project to really try to think about some of these issues that Monica specifically raised. We'll talk a little bit about why we need to think about social technical scenarios in particular and focus them in this direction, and then some challenges and questions that we have, and to add to some of the ones that we hope you will raise in response to our talk. So next slide, thanks. So the Stamina project is very timely. It's actually about pandemic situations. The idea is to increase the capability of pandemic planners and responders to manage, diagnose, and predict pandemic situations. The proposal was actually written long before coronavirus and one before coronavirus, so we're actually adopting it to the lessons learned from COVID-19 actively right now, which is a very interesting process. The idea is to think differently about how to pair all the different types of technologies and tools to really understand where the risks lie in a pandemic so that planners and responders can better work with each other. And part of it also is around what kinds of data need to be shared to do this. How do we better understand how we need to communicate about risks, or what kinds of decision support or cooperation is necessary to make this work. And the project is within the EU, it's outside. We have countries, Turkey and Tunisia as well involved. There's 37 partners. There'll be 12 trials, so 12 different scenarios have to be written, and one large scale simulation exercise. Next slide. So now we'll move on to the Driver Plus to explain how we're going to do that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Katrina. So first of all, for understanding, so in the proposal of the Stamina project, we have agreed on using the Driver Plus trial guidance methodology, and I'm quite happy to see also some people from the Driver Plus consortium. Hello, Haim and Marcel, at that stage. When we were preparing the slides, we had some discussions about the expectations management. So maybe shall we share some scenarios as good examples or so? But actually, we are not at that stage, as currently the trials are about to be prepared. And I think Haim and Marcel know very well how intensive exactly the preparation phase is and how important it is to make a good trial. So we will not tell you about what we will do in Stamina, but basically how we will approach scenarios. And the way how the trial guidance methodology tackles this question is actually that we do have two starting points. One starting point is actually to look at the gaps from the practitioners. So that's why practitioners are in the center of the trial designs. The other way is that maybe the practitioner knows about a solution that might be interesting for their realities, or there is a solution provider being convinced that this is a good innovation for a certain application domain. And with the TGM, we provide an opportunity to assess those innovations in a non-operational context through a structured approach. And I will briefly talk about the underlying principles on this process. So I will not be able, due to time constraints, to tell or to explain each of those 8 principles, but I would like to highlight 2. One is the practitioner-driven approach, and the second thing is the robust assessment. I like the question that Monica raised in the beginning, asking whether practitioners do know best. And I would like to rephrase this question and ask, what does who know best when it comes to scenario design? And this is a little bit a remnants on Richard Chambers working on whose reality counts. So that's why we put the practitioners in the beginning through the whole process up to the end, meaning all things that have to be prepared when it comes to what are we looking at, which solutions do we want to assess, how do we want to assess them, in which scenario, how do we perceive those solutions, do they provide any added value to the practitioner realities, and that's how we want to create, especially this term that was also stressed by Monica, which is trust. And that's when using the trial guidance methodology, we kind of have a little of a paradigm shift when it comes to who is designing what, because yes, it is clear that when it comes to analysis of certain aspects, there might be some researchers out there who are very skilled in, I don't know, a certain analysis approach. But in the end, we have to start from those realities which actually counts. So even within a response organization, there can be different understandings of a problem, and there can be even different understandings of how a process looks like, how an operation is executed. When using the trial guidance methodology, what happens is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, the starting point, no matter whether it is a gap or an innovation that is already out there and would like to be assessed by a group of practitioners, we define certain objectives in order to narrow the scope and make it doable. So this is a kind of a subsidiary principle, so that people within an organization are first, identified when defining the trial context, meaning like when we are talking about a certain innovation for one particular group, those practitioners who are in this reality know best who is affected. And with affected, I don't mean in a negative sense, but who is connected, like who is communicating with whom, who are the beneficiaries, who are the stakeholders probably, and they can tell us best about those. They can also tell best about how these scenarios usually should look like. And the second thing that I wanted to say is a little bit, skipping the whole preparation phase over the execution up to the analysis. And here we use a 3-dimensional approach, which is basically covering all these aspects which I have just mentioned. The first one is the trial dimension. So if the practitioners tell you that in a scenario, we have, 27 profiles of experienced responders, practitioners, citizens, this can be a metric or an objective that you should ensure in your trial design. That's what the trial dimension is. It's a little bit like controlling the setup of the experiment or the trial. Then there is the solution dimension, and that is basically something that refers to, let's say, traditional approaches when assessing innovations. So we are talking here about usability studies, technology readiness level, and so on and so forth. But in the middle and the center of the whole trial design, we define the crisis dimension to be relevant, which actually identifies the mission objectives. And from those mission objectives, things are derived. So that's the trial guidance methodology in a nutshell. For those who would like to learn more, I have added here the link to the trial guidance methodology website, which is currently available in 9 languages, as you can see. And whenever you have a question, please don't hesitate to write me an email. And I'm handing over back to Katrina.
All right. So now I'm going to say, with the intro to how the general methodology, now I'm going to push it even further and go, why do we need these scenarios to be social technical? Why can't we just look at them from the user, from the practitioner, from one specific area? Why does it have to be everything combined and mixed together? So I'm going to take us back down to the ground a little bit and go, let's say you wanted to design a scenario to test a new tech or practice, say. I'm going to oversimplify a case, two examples really quickly and say, let's say I want to design an airbag. Well, you know, is an airbag a benefit? Does it help reduce risk? Okay, well, yeah, it does. It keeps people from hitting their heads in the cars. But not as much for women, because they aren't designed technically for the women's body. They're designed for a man's body. So they actually don't hit many women in the right places to create that same and equal security. And not especially for pregnant women who have to actually turn them off in the cars, because then they become a danger. So while as a general, in the broad sense, it's good. How and who and what you consider in that scenario when you design it to understand, is the technology helping reduce risk? Is it mitigating risk? Is this part of the practice? It changes the question. Similarly, if I want to add the question about, is it okay to run a red light, to ask some of the ethics questions within the scenario too. Can I run a red light? Well, if you just design your scenario, say, around policy and policy gaps, well, there is no policy gap there. No, it's not okay to design a scenario. That's one thing. It's not okay to run a red light. That's one thing. But let's say you want to fold in a few other things into that scenario. Well, it really depends on what features you consider in that context around you. What is that crisis situation you're looking at? Or what is the situation in general? So are you running a red light because it's midnight? You've sat there for 10 minutes, there's nobody else around, and you finally have decided on your own that that light is broken and you have to drive through it. Maybe that's the case. Or are you running a red light because there's nobody else around, but you've a medical emergency in your car, you're trying to get them to the hospital? Are you running a red light, but there's children standing on the sidewalk? You know, you're not supposed to say there's nobody to hurt, there's nobody around, but there's children on the sidewalk watching you break the rules and getting away with it. And there's lessons they're learning. This is way oversimplifying the case, but it's talking about how once you start adding that complexity around there, around what the situation is, that's social technical, then it becomes a lot harder to say yes to no, or that there is a right or wrong answer, or what a good or bad decision is in this case. And this has become especially prescient as we start to think through things like the COVID case. So I don't know if you can go to the next slide. So one up. Sorry.
One up.
You went two. Yeah. No, other way. Yeah, no, thank you. All right. So if you just ask the what about, you know, is our planning around the virus good? Then you can have these sort of concentric circles of scenario. So are you looking at just the end users? Are they having good or bad planning? Are you looking at people in society? Can they catch the virus? Are you looking at maybe the next level around? Are you having to maybe take care of somebody who's ill? Or you can go out one step further and say, are we looking at the health or social system not keeping pace? And those are very, very important questions. But they don't really tell you anything about the who or the where or the situation to really ground how you're determining if your technology or your plans that maybe you're building a scenario around really manage this. So let's go now to the next slide. So if you start to add in a little bit more detail around the social cultural, around maybe the tools that you've got to use, bring that all in together, then it becomes a little more visible what's happening. So on the one hand, you have decision makers, and what you're actually addressing is their responsibility and accountability. The next level, you have the person in society, and you're dealing with, are they getting ill? Are they dying? Can they get good care? Are they a vector? Now you have then also primary and secondary contacts who also have a separate set of risks. It's not just about taking care of the person who's ill, but do they have to self-isolate, quarantine? Can they go to work? Can they go to school? Are they able to provide that care? And then even bigger on the community, it's not just can the healthcare keep up, it's is there socioeconomic damage from lockdowns? Are there stigmas from labels applied to people or sources of the virus or vectors? Are there differential vulnerabilities? And does everybody recover at the same pace equally? Does everybody then trust? If you go to the next slide, it starts to get a lot more complex then. You can start to ask much more complex questions about how risks that need to be managed and mitigated in risk management can vary so directly, and how a scenario has to be this rich to manage it. So are you a young person catching a virus, but you have no symptoms, so you're asymptomatic? What about being a parent and catching the virus with only mild symptoms, but you have long-term effects? Or being elderly and catching the virus and dying alone in a care home where you can't see your family? Or being a front desk clerk and having to work a front desk grocery clerk and having to work regularly, but without risk regulation protections for you. And yet you're not the one who's immediately ill. So in that first generic version of those concentric circles, you wouldn't even be caught in any test or scenario or plan. What about the minority who, about being a minority ethnic community who gets ill but faces a 5 times rate of death because of systemic racism? What about being told mitigation measures, say such as you're only allowed to walk within a 5-kilometer radius of your house, that works really well in urban contexts, but in more rural or smaller city contexts, that means walking in areas where there aren't good sidewalks. You have to walk into the road to be able to create proper distance. But if you just drove 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers, you could be in the countryside, safe from everybody to get exercise. So, or even what about being the single mother and the child is sent home from school because of coronavirus, and now you have to homeschool and work at the same time, risking both of your mental health. Things like that. All of those suddenly can show up if you start to bring in this broader context. As Adam said, the next slide. Thanks. So really, what we're trying to do is figure out then how to take these broader sort of societal, cultural, ethical questions and fold them into the scenario methodology to try to contextualize in terms of who, in what circumstances, to what values, to what harms are the risks being tested and the tools being tested to support the risks. How do you see design and evaluation as a narrative? And can you do it with what relationships and over time? So to repeat what Monica already said, how do you do it as not a tick box of completion? How do you help understand what's good enough even to do it? You need this kind of richness. And you need to really situate the views, which can help see why some concerns or values matter more in some circumstances than others. So what a decision that might work in one case might not work in another. All right, Adam, I'm going to pass it back to you now.
Yeah, so in this discussion with Katrina, we also thought about what would be our summary, what would we like to highlight. And actually, we concluded that it would be better to end with some question to the audience. And I think I would leave it here because you all can read the slides. And we will not have a discussion beyond what is going on in the chat, which I could not check during presenting here. So thank you very much for your attention. You will also find our contact on the last slide, which is like here. So just in case you would like to follow up on something, please don't hesitate to write us an email.
Could you put those questions in the chat, actually? Could you copy and paste them into the chat, Adam? That'd be great. Thank you.
I will do them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And we'll just hand over smoothly to Alex.
Hello.
Screen, yeah, great.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes. Not quite yet. It's all black right now, but yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for this great and quite interesting webinar. I'm going to present the scenario builder, which was an outcome of the InPrep Horizon 2020 project. And I think it's a tool that it was co-designed with the end users and is addressing the real needs, and we develop it in quite iterative basis, I would say. So what is it? Scenario Builder is a tool for digitalizing complex and preparedness scenarios, and can provide detail to the second. Is about all command levels and actually acts as a trigger regarding the management of information that is shown in other tools in existing legacy systems of organization or within existing command and control. So from a picture that is shot back in the 70s, not so much have changed. We're still doing exercises with a lot of paperwork, with a lot of discussions, and these do not give us the ability to make more detailed, more complex scenarios that can increase the preparedness for the first responders and practitioners. So what is the solution? The solution could be actually like the one that we are proposing regarding on digitalizing scenario, which is a quite innovative process, let's say. But how it looks like, what we have developed. So actually, there is a first screen. When someone enters, there is a menu which gives some information on how to add the scenario. There are two parts. First, you have to create a scenario, and then you have to execute it, or you can add a series of other features that I'm not going to show here for respecting our time. It's about adding historical facts of what already happened in the past and see on whether we can create some decision rules about that. Here is one of the main screen where it is the screen of the timeline of incidents and the scenario process. We can see that there is a specific item in the timeline that has a lot of information behind, which is not currently shown. This is the overview where it can show the senders of a message or an event and who is going to receive that information, on whether there is a CBRN incident and so on. There are a lot that I'm going to show you next, and there is very friendly, very simple. You just press the play and this goes from one step to another, sending this information to other tools through a middleware, through command centers, through mobile C2s, or acts actually as the initiator for simulation tools, and can be used also further in training platforms where we can evaluate the first responders in terms of a variety of skills. Here is, let's say, the scenario building screen where we can create a series of scenarios, we can add events, we can add information, we can add the messages exchanged among agencies, we can add the assets on site, or we can update the assets. And going next on how it works is quite simple. Each scenario can have many incidents, and within each incident we can have multiple events where each event has its own information, its own data sources, and then we just execute the scenario. And there is a realistic part of having detail to the second scenarios. We can see a small example here regarding a forest fire. We can split an initial, let's say, incident to smaller ones, how the fire will last, on whether which resources are arriving there, if we have a CBRN incident, what is the dispersion across the maps and so on. And how this can be used by a stepwise approach. It's quite easy. It's just a few steps. I have created these, let's say, credentials here where you can actually go. I will copy paste them within the chat afterwards. You can try it of yourselves. Of course, it's not a product. It's currently under development, but you can see as a first glimpse on what we develop. So initially, a scenario can be created and adding some few information. Actually, to be honest, Scenario Builder contains currently 330 different fields of information that derive based on the first responders' input from our project. And then we go to a next step where we add the actors of the scenario. Actors can be except agencies, also volunteers. So the more information that we provide, we can also utilize them in case we need to evaluate them. So there are different levels of command, different agencies, also different countries. And this is, let's say, a pain point where in PrEP project addressed, because what we do in PrEP is how we increase the preparedness at a transboundary basis. And there is certain gaps here, I think, and a lot of space for improvement across EU. And currently, at the next step, you may add the assets. An asset can belong to an organization, can have a call sign. When we talk about assets, we mean human resources, but also vehicles or other type of equipment. Each asset can have its own location on the map. We can place information on whether this is available or if it is not available. And actually, this can be more live if we consider the mobile C2 capabilities that are currently available. So we can know the location of the assets at any time, and we can have both virtual information of making assets available or unavailable, and we can have also the real information from mobile C2s as well. The next step is that we add a series of incidents, and each incident can have a small color code, let's say, in order level to assign events for each type of incident. The event can be an explosion, a hazmat leakage, a fire, or whatever we may think. And each event can involve, let's say, a set of agencies that are going to receive information. As said before, different countries. It can have the description or any kind of extra information, the location, the duration on how much this event lasts, and so on. Data sources are, let's say, extra information that can be added within a scenario in order to enhance it. It can be, let's say, a simulation or an hazard impact assessment, or an assessment in telecommunications or the electrical grid, or any other idea that we want to add. Actually, in the scenario builder, we did this in a quite dynamic manner. So scenario builder do not have predefined values hard-coded. It just sent a request to a middleware, and the middleware responds back with what are the available tools. So the exercise trainer can set up, let's say, the initial values and send a trigger to the simulation tool in order to start their simulation, for example, regarding the propagation of a chlorine or another hazardous gas. Info messages is another ability that can be provided for virtualizing information, as we also moving towards digital twinning capabilities. So we can virtualize social media posts or virtualize all messages that exchange across agency and across different, let's say, command levels. So we can see strategic command level message to the operational or to the tactical, and we can then afterwards evaluate what was their response and what they were doing. So each message may have a sender, may have a receiver, the agencies that are going to receive the body of the messages, any kind of pictures that maybe there are on site, and so on. Asset updates, as we explained previously, can be if I want, for example, I have some C2s and I want to exchange the location of some assets to make them unavailable because we were in one exercise and actually the exercise trainer wanted to see that the tactical level should send the right troops on site, should send the right resources, not too much, not too little, and that was one of the most important questions. The time plan is a pretty easy process. We add the duration among different incidents, not the same with the duration of the incident. Maybe before, let's say, a police car arrives, there are some minutes that are passing. We can incorporate this to the scenario. As said before, we can create detail to the second scenarios, and we can provide some abilities on how this can be done very fast, so we can have duplication of information for items in order to create rapidly scenarios or change scenarios on the go if it is needed. So after we finish, let's say, with the scenario, then we go to the scenario execution. We create a new execution. We can choose what trainees are going to participate. Just we play the start button. Then we go to this screen where there are various capabilities. We can play, we can, let's say, execute the scenario in a fast-forward manner. So no need to remain 5 minutes until the next one. So a trainer can choose or whether some incidents can go faster, or, for example, we can edit on the go or add extra incidents, extra events as the scenario is playing, because we may want to make the exercise harder or more easier. There are a series of other key features like the exporting to PDF. Incident managers found this very useful because they want to have a short overview where they can print it or they can send it to other strategic level agencies and can take some notes. And also there is another capability from exporting to another format type, the JSON, where we can utilize it if we want to import a scenario in order to draft more rapidly, let's say, a previous scenario. Scenario planning is, within the scenario builder, is a quite open process. It can be done in a, let's say, collaborative manner where a scenario can be shared across different agencies, across a group of people within my organization. We can provide read-only capabilities or edit capabilities. We can have open scenarios. I mean, open can be open for the whole Europe, or we can have private scenarios that can be a dedicated crisis scenario that is for a terrorist attack, and this cannot be openly. And so there are other capabilities like visualizing the history of changes, what we have done. This was also,
we're a little bit short of time. Could you?
Yes, there are. I will be quite fast. So other things is the version control, which we can have or other versions, but we come to the next question, which is it viable, the market that we are working? And actually it is. We see that the global factors like radicalization, natural disasters, and so on have drive the market, that are a lot of need for governments in order to train people. I'm not going to explain all of this, but certainly digitalization and the ability to integrate scenario capabilities within existing legacy systems is quite important, because we can run scenarios without, let's say, the tactical level know the difference between real or virtual. And actually, we can minimize cost, we can replicate scenarios doing virtual top exercise. And this means that we maximize participation, because field scale exercise were quite expensive for engaging the whole type of personnel for an organization. There are still a lot of things that we can do, and this we can do it together, regarding how we create scenarios, how we gamify, how we can evaluate trainees per command level, per incident, per agency, and we have already started engaging AI capabilities. There have been some good quotes that we have received while we were doing the scenario builder. Of course, I cannot disclose their names, but they found quite important, because they can evaluate and engage even more people. So here at Exus, we are always open to collaborations, and it would be a pleasure if we can collaborate together on this. Thank you.
That's great, Alex. Thank you very much. There's quite a few questions for you in the chat, but we will just hand over to Tina to share her screen and start her presentation, please.
Great. Now it's there. Navigated environment, and also to support their logistics. And if you go now to the fourth slide, I think. That's a lab. That's my crew. Then there should be a video where you can see a bit more about the project. I'm not sure if Monica is on it as well, but are you on it? If that plays.
It won't play, Tina. Just go.
Okay.
Go.
Then next slide. Yep. So the challenge in these humanitarian disasters is, of course, that it's an extremely complex environment, and many of you will know that. But just so one of our first challenges, and also there working with our technology developers and hardware and software developers, like, you know, who are we actually designing for? And then the second thing was, okay, this looks like a huge mess, which is basically the message from this slide. But also then, okay, but what are sort of the processes and standards that all these people follow? And I very vividly remember, like, the software architects and the designers, they were getting a major nightmare from this, because it is also volatile and also emerging in that humanitarian context. And so one of our first challenges was actually finding out, how do the processes look? How do people actually work? And how can we support them in that? Next slide. Yeah, so that was the exercise of really trying to understand workflows and work practices to get to a deep understanding of what are they actually doing. And again, that's extremely context dependent. So even if you talk like the Middle East broadly, then the situation within Syria is very different from the situation in Turkey or in Lebanon. And that is, again, very different from Yemen. And then all these organizations, depending on whether or not you're a UN agency or whether you're an NGO, an international, a big one, a small one, they can have different processes and policies. And we were in the first step then trying to bring that to sort of a common denominator, understanding how, for instance, this is a logistics process, how these things work, and what also would make them interoperable. Next. Yeah, and then based on that, we also built sort of the requirements and created systems architectures for that. But of course, and that is already then a means. So we have then a workflow, we have tools and technology to support the workflow, and that is then already a step towards understanding and knowing what you want to then test and evaluate. And namely, that is if these workflows with the technology are somehow working more effectively and efficiently than without. Next slide. Yeah, and then of course we were also, so the new technology that we developed, we were also looking at how that would integrate into the humanitarian system, and that similar exercise can of course be done with any technology you would want to introduce in a more civil protection setting. Next. Okay, so I said it before, we used games for that, and the main reason for that was that it is absolutely not an option to test this technology in the context and situation that I just mentioned. Now, there are, of course, various games that one can use. For instance, training games, which you are probably most familiar with. So that is just games that you use to train specific skills. Teaching games, often used in educational institutes, like where I'm working. Games for experimentation, where we are closer getting into research, where you want to try and test out theories or hypotheses. Research, then trying to obtain data, empirical material, and operational games to actually help planning and decision making. Okay, next. The games that we chose were actually situated, yeah, you can see it here. We were trying to balance fidelity, meaning trying to mimic the situation as it actually happens then potentially in the field. And of course, the closest you can get to that is in an operational exercise where you just play out something. But we were also still interested in, understanding and measuring and how far the technology supported, in our case, then decision-making, coordination, and logistics processes. So we needed some degree of control over the process and some more advanced means to collect data so that we could compare, like with the iTRACK system and without the iTRACK system. If you would go more to the data quality and control, then you have also simulation or analytical models, but these, of course, risk to not have the richness of the context. And that's why we thought that these simulation games were actually quite ideal step in that. Next. Okay, so what we did in iTRACK, we ran two very different types of games. On the left side, you see a board game that we actually used to elicit these workflows and the requirements for the technology in the initial design phase. And that allowed us to have a relatively lightweight way to understand how these humanitarian decision makers were reasoning and elicit the processes. On the right-hand side, you see one picture of the actually simulation exercise we ran. And as you can see, that was an augmented a hybrid exercise where we use digital technology to sort of create missions and let people do activities, but where we were also really simulating on the campus of TU Delft, for instance, a checkpoint that had to be recognized and to try and or rerouting people to try and see if that actually works. Of course, that is requires a lot of preparation. And we had huge Excel sheets where everybody had to be and how these simulation exercises needed to be run. I think the scenarios were also quite complicated. We, of course, used sort of similar building blocks of incidents that could happen or steps that had to be foreseen. But, here you can think about something like a 250-line Excel sheet that was sort of the scenario master template. So that is not a lightweight exercise, and you should very well know what you're doing once you get into that. Okay, next slide. How we evaluated that. I said it before, we of course had our framework from an understanding about the workflows and the processes, and we knew what and how we wanted to support it. We also were using the benchmarks from largely humanitarian guidelines, for instance, on logistics and information management, which we used as a sort of the standard. And then we were checking, do people adhere to that process? And is it in any way faster, better, more efficient than what we have seen without the technology? To keep track of that, we used several means. We were on campus, and what you can see down there in the bottom is somebody trying to record everything. So we had cameras and microphones everywhere. Then we were a project that was developing monitoring and tracking technology. So of course we also used that very technology to look, for instance, where were people driving, how long did it take them to deliver a package from A to B, did anything get lost? And then we were, of course, also working with questionnaires, and that was more on the user-friendliness and usability of the tools and technology. And all of that we combined to sort of a comprehensive evaluation package. Okay. Yeah. The game design. cycle that we went through. Also, just to give you a bit of background, Adam talked about what was done in Driver, but of course there's a wide sort of literature on how you can design such a game. So there is first a design cycle where you actually try to understand the requirements of the game, you prototype it and you test it. We did that largely in-house with students. And then you would run more the empirical cycle and try and test out the game. And importantly, also running such an exercise or developing such a game is nothing that you would do well with just one step. So as you can see in this webinar, trying and testing is important. Okay, next. And these here are just examples of how we then worked in that iTRACK game on the requirements, on the first and the second prototype, and then on the analysis with player choices, feedbacks, what went well, what was interesting, what was unrealistic, what needed to be improved, to then develop the final game, which was actually used both to understand then decision-making and coordination mechanisms and processes, and fed into the further development of the technology. Yeah. Design recommendations. So one is that it's quite a challenge to develop these games for disaster settings, because this is, of course, a field that is very dynamic, highly uncertain, and where, a game, pandemics were mentioned in the beginning, people would have probably said for such a pandemics game, if we had played last year through a situation as it is now, that was completely unrealistic. But, things change, and we have to keep that in mind and also be relatively flexible with the scenarios, for instance, we develop. And then I said it before, games are only one way to capture data related to the human factor. There are others. And then the final point, exactly, games are useful because they have a high level of fidelity and let players understand and sort of experience a situation as it would be in the field. That also means that it is very different from, for instance, a behavioral experiment where you have a very controlled setting. And as a researcher, or also as a control room of these exercises, you have to let go of control in a way. So you have to let players create their own reality and make of your game that you have so beautifully designed, whatever they make of it. So let them explore and observe, and then use these observations to improve, one, the game and the scenarios and what you're doing on the ground, but also then to learn from, if they are starting to misuse your technology, then you also learn, what can be done with it. And so thanks for your attention. And I think we still have a round of questions at some point.
That's fantastic, Tina. Thank you very much. Actually, we have, we are already in our break now. We have a workshop starting at 10:30 for me, 11:30 for you. But I think we can take a few minutes for people to just pick up on one question that came up during their talk, and then maybe pose one question for you. There are already some questions for you. So if you look at the questions that are there for you while we talk, then if you could respond to one of them, then we can finish before the workshop starts. Okay?
Okay.
Yep. So I just have one question that Philippe and Graham both asked in different ways. So Philippe said, practitioners are often suspicious of technologies because how do they know that will make them more efficient? And Graham said that many technologies fail because the vendors aren't brought on board fast early enough, or not at all. And my answer to those two questions are that we need to find ways of working together between practitioners, developers of technologies, vendors, researchers. And I think these kind of scenarios, use cases, games are the only way that allow us to deal with that complexity, because we all have different motivations, and efficiency means different things for different people. For managers, efficiency is like faster, cheaper. For practitioners, it is better quality. So that would be a quick question and answer from me. Can I go to Adam and Katrina? One of you reply to one question, please.
Adam, do you want to go or should I?
Ladies first, please.
Oh, well, okay then. So actually, Monica, one of the questions you asked really is, I found quite provocative, which is one of the things we're trying to figure out, which is what can stamina do, or what can our methods in stamina do to spot these unintended consequences and complexities of innovation? And it's something I'm trying to figure out. So if you have all of these concentric circles, how do you know which ones will help you see these unintended, the cascades that you didn't see, the unforeseen? And one of the things that I've just been thinking about is we have 12 opportunities to do these testing, right, to explore how this could work. And maybe one of the things we could do is try out different places in those concentric circles and different sort of contextual richness to see which ones help us see differently. And we can actually do a bit of an experiment about how the contexts and the different contexts, what they reveal. But I think it's actually like, I just wanted to more highlight the question because I think that's exactly the question to be asking, not less than I have an answer.
Yeah, that's great, Katrina. Anax, can you pick one of your questions and respond to it?
Yes, I will pick the one question about...
briefly, Anax, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, about the emergency management system and whether we have combined with existing systems. The answer is that scenario builder do not intend to replace your existing systems, but play together and again as a trigger showing the information within your existing tools. That's that.
Great. And then Tina, have you had a chance to look through your questions and pick one that you might want to?
So, some great questions, and I think the broad spectrum is between how do you make sure that people think that what you're doing is realistic, and then how do you still run some standardized and representative measurements on that, and that's actually a balancing act. So like you try to match the reality of what practitioners are actually facing with some more standardized instruments. And of course, for instance, for the surveys and for the measurement tools, we used also standardized survey tools, for instance, on usability and situational awareness. To get as far as possible. But for instance, with the issue of being representative, there are only so many people who are working in Syria on the response there that you can get to a test game in Europe. So in a way, you have to also then, if you have 10 people of this caliber, that's already fantastic. And you are never going to have a sample of 1,000 people or 2,000 that you can have in a survey style of thing. So that's why I also said games are just one of the possible research instruments that you can use.
That's fantastic, and I think a really good lead into our workshop. So these webinars are for knowledge exchange and getting to know each other and getting together, and we've got a whole ton of questions in the chat. And what we thought for this webinar is that we add a workshop, a 1-hour workshop, where some of us come together and go into an online collaborative workspace and try and continue the discussion and try and come up with a few answers. And for this workshop, the aim is really to think about this idea of the use case scenario games exchange. So can we build an exchange that helps us build on each other's work and get a bit further with the challenges that we've all raised here. So I would like to thank everybody, especially the speakers, but the whole group of everybody coming together and doing this work. And invite those of you who come to the workshop to go into this Padlet and start putting your thoughts into it. And thank Marie-Christine. And if you want a couple of final words, Marie-Christine, to close us off, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Monica. I think it was a very inspiring session with a lot of ideas, and it's also very reassuring to see that there are a lot of initiatives to keep or to bring the practitioner in the center this process. So I think that we should learn from this different initiative so that we could develop this further and ensure this role for the practitioner. I will just, before we move to the work itself and to the Padlet collaborative session, so we will be split into the different groups. I would just like to make some publicity, if I can, for the next event that we're organizing. We will have our online conference next January around 4 topics about useful and usable and trustworthy artificial intelligence system for PPDR. That's rightly the point of some of the discussion of today. Cybersecurity, resilience, and 5G. Climate emergency, what challenges for PPDR organizations, and also new space application, what future use cases for PPDR. So if you're interested, please join. It will be an open event as well.